start by looking at some of the causes and effects of the War of 1812. And then second, we'll look to the aftermath of the War of 1812 and how it intersected with Latin American independence. And we'll step back and look a bit at how Latin American independence shaped the United States. And here, that's going to address part of Standard 5E, because that's going to bring us to the Monroe Doctrine, which is part of Standard 5E. And so with that as our roadmap, I want to just jump right into the War of 1812. And I want to start just by asking you, maybe in the chat, how do you approach the War of 1812 when you teach it? How does it fit into the narrative that you're building in your history classes? Do you discuss it at all? Maybe that's another question I should ask. Any thoughts in the chat about how you teach the War of 1812? Yes, so I see Jennifer, you do the War of 1812 in one day, cause, event, effect. Diana, you emphasize impressment as part of the reason for the War of 1812. That's great. We'll talk a little bit about that and some of the sort of new scholarship on impressment, which I think is really interesting. And Eric, you're saying you consistently get requests from teachers for help in teaching the War of 1812. Okay, great. That's all really helpful to know. And hopefully I can offer some insights today on some of the new thinking about the War of 1812 and how it fits into early US foreign relations more generally. So just to situate ourselves in place and time, right? The War of 1812 is from 1812 to 1815. And when I teach the War of 1812, I group the causes into two main areas. I talk about an Atlantic theater, or kind of an Atlantic engine of the war, and then a continental or North American theater of the war. So we'll just jump right in by taking those one by one, starting with the Atlantic causes of the war. So the Atlantic causes of the War of 1812 started in Europe, which was absolutely ravaged by warfare at this moment. So what happened in Europe was that after the French Revolution, Napoleon here had risen to power on promises to restore order to France. But instead of restoring order, Napoleon just sort of kind of sends Europe into continued chaos. So in 1803, Napoleon declares war on Great Britain, and Britain and France essentially remained at war for over a decade, and they kind of suck much of the rest of Europe into that war with them because of Europe's system of dynastic alliances, right? The rest of Europe kind of lines up either behind Britain or behind France. And it's really all that President Jefferson can do here to keep the United States from getting pulled into that conflict as well. Jefferson spends much of his presidency trying to keep the United States out of the Napoleonic Wars. Any thoughts as to why? Like, why would Jefferson and Jeffersonians have wanted to avoid getting pulled into the Napoleonic Wars? In Jefferson's thinking, what's the problem with fighting a war at this moment? Any ideas? A lack of a military. Ernest, yes, absolutely. So one of the first things Jefferson did after his inauguration in 1801 was he dramatically reduced the size of the army. He cut the Navy till it was just like a half dozen ships. So the United States wasn't especially well equipped to fight a war. Right, Diana, Jefferson wanted a smaller government. Don, the war would have been too costly, too much power required. Yes, absolutely. So the thing about wars is they required bigger armies, bigger navies. Those things probably required more taxes, more money to pay for that militarization, and a bigger government to oversee and direct all of that change, right? So Jefferson desperately wants to keep the United States out of these wars, but Europe is making it really hard for the United States to remain neutral in this conflict. Essentially, Britain says to the United States, don't trade with France or else. France says to the United States, don't trade with Britain or else. So essentially both sides are saying to the United States, if you're not with us, you're against us. And so the the United States, which needs to trade with someone because Jefferson's whole vision of that kind of agrarian yeoman economy depended on farmers being able to sell their corn and their wheat and their tobacco and other crops overseas. The United States, Jefferson is really in an impossible situation where he needs foreign trade, but he can't easily access it. And so in this unenviable situation, Jefferson very reasonably plays for time, right? He sends out his diplomats, his ambassadors all over, and he tells France and Britain in no uncertain terms that the United States is a neutral power, and that according to the law of nations, a sort of early version of international law, that the United States therefore had the right to trade with belligerents on both sides of the conflict, so that the US could trade with Britain and with France, which is true. That is what international law said. But the Napoleonic Wars were a total war, right? So here's an image that romanticized the Napoleonic Wars, like images of war often do. Here's a more realistic image of the catastrophic violence of the Napoleonic Wars. This is by the Spanish artist Francisco de Goya, Execution of the 3rd of May. Actually, this is the moment in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars. This is where our modern day term guerrilla comes from, in the sense of guerrilla warfare. It comes from the Spanish word guerrilla, or little war. And it was used starting in the Napoleonic Wars to describe the kinds of tactics that people in Spain used to oppose Napoleonic rule. Also, this is actually the origins of our modern day term liberal, right? Liberal liberales in Spain were opposing this Napoleonic occupation. So anyway, just an interesting sidebar. So the point is, these Napoleonic Wars were a total war. And in this total war, where everything is on the line for France and for Britain, they decide that they simply can't accept US neutrality, right? Whatever, regardless of what international law says, they're not going to accept US neutrality. So Britain responds first by impressing as many as 6,000 American sailors on British ships. So I think, Diana, maybe you said in the chat that you talk a lot about impressment as one of the causes of the war. So impressment was basically a form of maritime kidnapping, right? It meant that Britain's Royal Navy would send ships all over the Atlantic. And when they found US merchant ships on the high seas, they would forcibly stop them, they would board them, and search them for supplies bound to France, but also for sailors they could impress and force instead to serve in the British Royal Navy. Now, Britain's justification, I mean, this sounds pretty egregious, right? But Britain's justification was that they were just impressing British subjects who had deserted from the Royal Navy, right? Britain says, oh, we're just taking these deserters back to the Royal Navy where they belong. But that opens all kinds of problems. I mean, for one thing, how do these British sailors who board US ships, how do they know who's an American sailor and who's British, right? I mean, this is just a few decades out of the American Revolution. So Americans and Brits still had often similar accents. They were culturally similar. It was hard to tell just from looking, right? Ships had famously kind of cosmopolitan international crews at this moment. Passports were just starting to be a thing. And anyway, they were pretty easy to forge at this moment. So some sailors actually went so far as to tattoo their nationality onto their bodies. They would say, their name and American or whatever, to try to make their nationality more convincing, to try to protect themselves from this kind of impressment. But still, you could lie about that, right? It's just really hard to tell who's American and who's British. But the bigger problem was that Britain actually denied the right of its subjects to rebel, right? Britain's position was once a subject, always a subject. And so from that perspective, Americans weren't really Americans because they had never had the right to rebel from the British Empire in the first place. So you can see how through these acts of impressment, they're not just like impressing American sailors. I mean, that's an affront to US citizenship, right? But they're also contesting the very legitimacy of the American Revolution itself, right? Meanwhile, France is pressuring the United States to take sides in this conflict as well. And so again, Jefferson is stuck in this tight situation where he needs trade, but he can't access it. So, if we had a lot of time, we could talk about the embargo and these sort of intermediate steps Jefferson takes to try to avoid war, but still access foreign trade. But for lack of time, I'm just going to skip ahead and say eventually what happens in 1812 is that the Jeffersonians opt to declare war. And so by now, there's a new president, James Madison, another Virginia Jeffersonian. And in 1812, President Madison asked Congress to declare war on Britain, and Congress obliges in a sharply divided and fiercely partisan vote. So what this means is just one generation or so after the American Revolution, the United States and Britain are back at war once again. And so Jeffersonians actually referred to the War of 1812 as a second war for independence, right? A revolution all over again. Now, as a sidebar, let me just come back and note the irony here, which is that Jeffersonians, Jefferson and Madison, they wanted to avoid a war for all the reasons we talked about, right? Wars made the army bigger, the navy bigger, higher taxes, bigger government, right? A war would potentially accelerate manufacturing because of all the mobilization you needed to do, right? You have to rebuild that navy, the warships, the guns, and a bigger government to oversee and direct those changes. So it's kind of a core irony of the war that the means of mobilizing for and fighting that war ended up kind of undermining the ends of the war, right? Of the Jeffersonian vision to have a smaller government and a sort of more agrarian economy, right? So anyway, that's just sort of an irony that I think is really interesting to play up. But at this point, we've described the War of 1812's origins by looking east to Europe, right? We've talked about impressment, the Napoleonic Wars, transatlantic trade. So that is sort of a distillation of an Atlantic engine of this war. But there's another key cause of the War of 1812, and that has to do with conflicts with indigenous nations in the West. So now we're going to turn to a continental or North American explanation of this war. Because at the same time that Britain was impressing US sailors on the high seas, indigenous nations west of the United States were building a confederation, an alliance of their own, one designed to counterbalance US expansion. These efforts were led in part by a Shawnee leader named Tecumseh here on the left, and his brother Tensegotawa on the right. And this is really important. I mean, the underlying problem here is that Jefferson's whole agrarian vision, his whole vision of this kind of yeoman republic, was fundamentally and aggressively expansionist, right? Because it relied on lots of land for all of those yeomen and their children and their children's children right on through the generations to be able to move on to and farm. And in order for Jefferson's kind of yeoman families to move on to this land, they first had to push indigenous families off of that land. So Tecumseh, for example, he's a little boy during the American Revolution, and he and his family have to flee their home, I think like 5 times as American armies burn his house and his town, right? So he grows up kind of understanding what this new United States, this new nation, this new presence in North America, what it means for, in his case, the Shawnee and for other indigenous nations. So Tecumseh, Tensegotawa, other indigenous people understand this very well, that Jefferson's foreign policy, this idea of the yeoman republic, was fundamentally expansionist. And so Tecumseh and other indigenous leaders spend a lot of the early 19th century strategizing, traveling through sort of the interior, like the Great Lakes region and further south, building alliances in an attempt to keep their families and their nations intact on the lands that they owned. And what's more, and what's a kind of a crucial link to the War of 1812, is that some of these indigenous leaders were reaching out to the British just across the border in British Canada to kind of sound out the possibility of an Anglo-Indigenous alliance against the expansionist United States. And so that gives the Jeffersonians a whole nother reason to declare war on Great Britain, right? Jeffersonians say, oh, Britain is inciting Indigenous people to rebel. Now, in fact, that statement, that way of framing it, was a way of, it implied that Indigenous people didn't have their own motives and their own kind of reasons to rebel. In fact, Native people are very active in building these alliances, right? But that does give the United States another reason to declare war on Great Britain. Now, if you want more on this topic, there's a really good PBS documentary series. It's called We Shall Remain. Maybe some of you have seen it or use it in your classrooms. There's several episodes, and I'll put this up on a slide at the end, and I'll email the PowerPoint to you so you don't have to scramble to write this down. But it's called We Shall Remain, and it covers Indigenous history from the 17th century through the 20th. There's a whole episode on Tecumseh, and for that matter, another really powerful one on the Trail of Tears and Indigenous expulsion. So I often show clips from those to my own students, and I think that with the proper kind of contextualization, they would work for 8th graders as well. Anyway, the reason I'm talking about all this is partly to say that US expansion and relations with Indigenous nations were another key cause of the War of 1812. But I also want more broadly to make the point that relations with Indigenous nations were a key form of US foreign relations, right? Foreign relations aren't just the United States and Europe, they're also between the United States and its sovereign Indigenous nations, right? Sovereign Indigenous, like Native American powers in North America. So one thing that I always have my students think about is this question of, was the early United States an imperial power, right? Was the US an imperial power, right? Maybe our knee-jerk reaction, I think, often is no, right? The United States had just fought the American Revolution. It's anti-imperial, right? It stands against empire. But if you think about, for starters, Native American history, then the United States looks quite different, right? I mean, part of this, the answer to this question, was the early United States an empire? That would depend on how you're conceptualizing empire. So here's one possible definition of empire from the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Daniel Walker Howe, right? He defines imperialism as a determination to expand geographically and economically, imposing an alien will upon subject peoples and commandeering their resources. So the question I have my students think about, and I just have to move my Zoom controls around so I can see it, is although the United States was no longer a British colony, right? They've fought the Revolution, War of 1812. Was the United States nonetheless a colonizing power in the context of North America more broadly, right? What if we think about the United States as a new imperial power in North America? So most leading historians over the last decade or two have answered this question in the affirmative, right? That the United States was this colonizing power in North America. And I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards if you're interested, because there's so much more to say here, right? It's one of the most important things that I hope my students take away from my history classes on the early United States and early US foreign relations, right? How the United States throws off British power only to become a new imperial power on the North American continent in its own right, right? So I think, that's an important kind of question to be asking as we consider this. And I'll come back to it in a bit when we discuss the Monroe Doctrine. But for now, let's see, just to come back to standard 5D, right? Some of the primary causes and effects of the War of 1812. We've seen Atlantic causes, and then we've seen the kind of continental causes relating to US relations with Indigenous nations who themselves are reaching out to the British and Canada, right? So now we'll turn really quickly to just a few of the effects of the War of 1812. We could obviously say much more about this, but essentially the war was in most ways a draw between the United States and Great Britain. It really kind of, the peace treaty really stabilizes relations along the US border with British Canada. The biggest diplomatic and military effect of the war was really for indigenous nations, because Tecumseh's efforts to build a pan-indigenous confederation ultimately failed, and the War of 1812 was really a major blow to indigenous power in much of Eastern North America. But I do want to emphasize here that indigenous people very much still remained, and in many places were really still thriving. So just to give two examples, right? Indigenous nations like the Cherokees and the Choctaws were growing in the 1820s, whether you go by their population, their numbers, by agricultural production, by heads of livestock, by number of schools, what have you. And that's because of their, resilience, their political, diplomatic, economic strategies. And the reason I make that point is that there's often like this trope in American history, the idea that Native people were doomed to disappear. That argument itself was a political argument that really served to justify continued dispossession, right? Because if you think that this is inevitable, that this is going to happen anyway, then that sort of absolves you of complicity, right? And so, in fact, if you actually look at the numbers in a lot of these indigenous nations, their numbers are growing in the 1820s. And that's because of their kind of continued diplomatic and political strategies. But in the War of 1812, also militarily and geopolitically, it does shift the balance of power in much of Eastern North America. So you can think of the War of 1812 as a key moment in the longer history of US colonialism toward indigenous nations in Eastern North America. Okay, so I want to move now to Standard 5E, and in particular, the part that talks about the Monroe Doctrine. And the main thing I want to talk about that kind of builds or paves the way to the Monroe Doctrine is, how did the War of 1812 and its aftermath intersect with Latin American independence? How did Latin American independence shape the US? And how does the Monroe Doctrine fit alongside a longer history of US expansion and empire? So we've got about 6 minutes or so, and I'll stop for questions. So I'll make this concise, but essentially, it's interesting because I just described the War of 1812 as, among other things, a spin-off of the Napoleonic Wars. You can actually say much the same thing about Latin America's independence wars, that they're also an offshoot of the Napoleonic Wars. Because what happened, just to come back to the Napoleonic Wars in Spain here, in 1807, 1808, Napoleon basically kidnapped Spain's monarchs. And so that led to a power vacuum, a crisis at the core of the Spanish Empire. And that imperial crisis gave some space for colonists in mainland Spanish America to start to declare independence. And in the end, between 1810 and 1825 or so, the entire Spanish American mainland, so everything from, from Mexico to Colombia to Chile, and including, of course, Texas, and I'm sure you all know that piece of the story quite well, right? All of that region declares independence, secures independence, and they establish republics. And so just to make this connection, right, that at the same time that the US is fighting its so-called Second War for Independence, Spanish Americans were embarking on their first. And here is Simon Bolivar. He's then and now often described as the George Washington of South America. He led the sort of independence movement in much of northern South America. And here's just one of the buildings still standing, as you can see, in Buenos Aires today, where some of the first moves towards independence were happening. So for the most part, the United States was really eager to see Spanish America declare independence and build republics. For one thing, the United States was eager to see more republics throughout the Western Hemisphere. Because people in the United States took credit for what was happening, they assumed, in other words, that Latin Americans were declaring independence because they were so inspired by the US example. In fact, as I just said, Spanish American independence more stems from the Napoleonic Wars and that context. But that's, of course, people in the US, have never had modesty as a national virtue. So they're very quick to take credit for this. And that means that Latin American independence really fuels US nationalism. And the US also welcomes Latin American independence, not just because they're excited to see more republics in the Western Hemisphere, but also because these new republics tend to throw open their ports to foreign trade. So Latin American independence seems to offer potential economic benefits to the US as well. So in 1822, the United States became the first nation in the world to recognize the independence of mainland Spanish America. It does the same thing for Brazil in 1824. And here's an image of Henry Clay, Speaker of the House for much of this period. He first rose to fame by helping to lead the United States into the War of 1812. After the War of 1812, the next thing he stakes his political reputation on is supporting Spanish American independence. It's so central to his identity as a politician that when he sits for this picture, what he's actually holding here is a copy of a resolution he had sponsored in the House in support of Spanish American independence. So if you could see this in person, you could actually read that that's what the writing says. So US recognition of Spanish American independence in 1822 paves the way for the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And the Monroe Doctrine was really just a short chunk of President James Monroe's 1823 State of the Union address. It stemmed from concerns that the more absolutist powers of continental Europe, like Russia, Prussia, Austria, that they might try to recolonize Latin America or maybe build new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So the Monroe Doctrine was trying to warn these European absolutists away from further colonization attempts in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine announced two principles of US foreign policy going forward, right? First, the Monroe Doctrine said that the US would stay out of strictly European conflicts. And then second, in return, just as the US wouldn't mess around in Europe's business, the Monroe Doctrine says that Europe can't mess around in the Western Hemisphere's business, right? Aside from the few places where Europe still had colonies like Cuba and Canada, essentially it says, no more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So essentially, the Monroe Doctrine was asserting a unique US interest in the Western Hemisphere. And it says that the US would consider any further European attempts to colonize the Americas as an affront to the United States itself. And just to be clear, subsequent presidential administrations, like later in the 19th, 20th centuries, would use the Monroe Doctrine as a justification for military intervention in Latin America. But that's not really what's happening in 1823. In 1823, the US talked a big game, but global power for the US was much more aspirational than real. In fact, does anyone know, what is the foreign country that really had the power and potentially the motive to warn other European powers away from further colonization attempts in the Western Hemisphere? Yes, Ernest, England. Yes, absolutely. Because Britain, which realized constitutional monarchy, not one of those European absolutist powers, Britain also had motive to support Latin American independence because they, like the United States, would have welcomed the chance to trade with all of these new nations suddenly throwing their ports open. So James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, who really was the mastermind behind the Monroe Doctrine, they know that if the more absolutist powers of continental Europe try to reestablish colonies in the Western Hemisphere, they know that Britain's probably going to intervene anyway for those reasons. So they're essentially, I always say that Britain was really the bite behind the Monroe Doctrine's bark. Anyway, just to sort of pull these themes together, what's interesting is that I talked earlier about the War of 1812 as a moment of imperialistic expansion and a moment of acceleration of dispossession of indigenous nations. The Monroe Doctrine connects to this narrative too. Historians have referred to the Monroe Doctrine as an example of imperial anti-colonialism, right? Imperial anti-colonialism. So it's an oxymoron, right? But here's what we mean by that, right? The Monroe Doctrine was anti-colonial because it was very clearly warning Europe, no more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But it was also an imperial statement because it's essentially asserting a US interest over the Western Hemisphere. It's the US was saying here, this is our special turf and Europe can't mess around in it. So in the Monroe Doctrine, we can see how on one hand, the US is imagining itself as the anti-colonial leader of an anti-colonial hemisphere, but it's also positioning the United States at the head of that hemisphere and asserting US influence over that hemisphere. And so that's a parallel to what I was saying earlier about the War of 1812, how on one hand, the US is an independent anti-colonial republic in the sense that it had rejected British colonial rule. But on the other hand, the United States was also imperialistic in the sense that it was trying to expand its influence and its territory into indigenous nations, and with the Monroe Doctrine, trying to expand its influence in Latin America as well. So I think I'll pause there and take any questions that all of you have.